So if I want to look at the services on my machine, I like to go to the run command a lot and type what I'm looking for, because as you've seen, Microsoft moves stuff into different areas, which it's very difficult for me to find. It's very frustrating for me, honestly. So you can hit Windows key and search for services if you'd like, which works pretty well. Or you can do Windows key services.msc. Okay, so what's a service? Let's take a look. So this pulled up on another screen. I'm just going to drag it over here. But one of the services that was mentioned was Windows Time thing. So let's see. Yeah, so let's scroll down, and here it is. So Windows Time maintains the date and time. Now, we want our computer to maintain our date and time without us having to log in and double-click Windows Time. So what happens? Windows Time starts up when the computer starts up, and it automatically starts syncing the time in the background. Now, this particular service, we can tell the startup type through manual. So what that means is something else calls this service to start. So here's our different options here. We've got automatic, which starts up automatically when the machine starts. You don't have to log in, you reboot, it starts up. You've got automatic delayed start, which means it starts up automatically. We wait a few minutes for the computer to start, and so it's like we're giving it a little bit lower priority. Manual means it can be started, but it needs something else to tell it to start, and then disabled clearly means it will not run at all. So those are the different options, and that's a great example, right? One of the things that it displays here is the path to the service. So the service is Windows Time, but the executable, all a service is an executable. And we know executables live in user mode. So Windows Time is actually just this executable that's running when something calls it. And this is the executable SBC host. Now let's talk about SBC host, because it actually shows up here under services, which makes sense. We just saw that. We saw the Windows Time service is actually service host, also known as sbchost.exe. What is sbchost.exe? Does anyone know, or has anyone ever seen this process or had a problem with this process, maybe consuming a lot of memory or consuming a lot of CPU? Has anyone ever had an issue with SBC host causing problems on the machine? Yeah. So yeah, it can cause problems for sure. So let's just go to our browser real quick. And this is, so let's just say we had a problem with SBC host. And let's just say it was giving us high CPU. There's a bunch of different hits that come back. You can see there's 5 pages of it. Let's use, we'll use Google real quick, because Google will give us a count of how many results came back. Well, there's 247,000 results that came back for high CPU. And if you read through it, you're going to notice there's a bunch of different symptoms that can cause, causes that can have high CPU on SBC host. So this is one of those, if you put this in, this is not going to be helpful to you, because there's a lot of things that can cause high CPU on SBC host. This is like saying the internet is down. There's a lot of things that can cause the internet to be down. Your machine may not be connected to a network. The router in your building may be down. Your firewall may be blocking it. The actual internet may be down. The page you're trying to get to may be down. So my wife is not a technical resource, a technical person at all when it comes to computers. So that is something I kind of expect from an end user. Hey, the internet is down. it's very generic. And if I do a search on can't get to internet, it's not helpful. There's 4.5 million responses to that. So we need to be a little more descriptive with our troubleshooting. So let's talk about SVC host and what it is so we can be more descriptive on that. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Task Manager. And I'm going to look for the executables to see if there's an SVC host process running. You all have stated that you've seen an issue with SVC host. Maybe high memory, maybe high CPU. What is the fastest way to open up Task Manager on your machine? Does anyone know? Fastest way to open up Task Manager. How do you all open Task Manager? Does anyone use Task Manager?
Click on the
so this is pretty
toolbar.
quick. Yeah, right-click Task Manager. That's pretty quick. Now, if you're in a VM, this is probably one of the fastest ways to do it. If you're on a physical machine, there's a faster way to do this. Does anyone know what it is? If you're like on your laptop, does anyone know of a faster way than right-clicking and doing Task Manager? So I know I can do Control-Delete, and I would say that's not faster, right? So does anyone know a faster way? All right. So the year was like 1999. So this was about 22 years ago. And I did desktop computer support. It was my first corporate job doing enterprise support. Prior to that, I worked at like a little family computer shop, and we sold new computers and did repair on computers. That was around like 97, 98. Back with Windows 95 was popular, Windows 98. Some of you may be in IT for that long, so some of you may remember 95 and 98. Some of you may be like, well, what is he talking about? He's really old. So this was back with the 95 also came on CD, but it also came on floppy disk. So you had a 3.5-inch floppy, and you had a bunch of disks. You could also set, or you had to set COM ports and IRQs. Some of you may know what I'm talking about, some of you may not. But there was typically 4 COM ports that got used, and you had to set the IRQ through either dip switches or jumper settings, if you all ever did that. Anyway, so I went into desktop support for a company that had about 400 employees in the office that I supported, and then they had a bunch of remote offices. And I did desktop with 2 other engineers. And I was, this is 1999, I was 19 years old at the time. And I didn't have a degree. I was going to school, and I didn't have any real corporate experience. This was my first job working corporate experience. And the 2 people that I worked with, one of them had a degree, and then the other one had a degree and then also had their MCSE, their Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer certificate. In the late 90s, that was a big deal. If you had that you had to take 6 tests to get that certification. Not many people had it, and it was you were almost guaranteed to get a job if you had that certification. So here I am feeling a little insecure. I knew computers okay, but I didn't know enterprise, like domain controllers, or we use Novell. If anyone ever has done anything with Novell, so I didn't know a lot about that. So I worked with 2 people that were a few years older than me, and so it kind of turned into this little competition to see. We work tickets, right, for end users, and so it turned into this competition to see who could close the most amount of tickets for each day. And so it was a friendly competition. We would all just kind of, hey, I've closed 7 tickets today, or so far, or whatever. So I worked with 2 other colleagues. One was named Rob, and one was named Maribel, and very, very smart people. So I would go to someone's desk, and back in the late 90s, we had PS2 mice and PS2 keyboard. Does anyone remember PS2 mice and PS2 keyboard? Yes. Okay. All right. So some of you just maybe bringing back some memory. So this was like Windows NT 4.0, and the problem with the PS2 mouse is this. When your cursor disappeared and stopped working, does anyone remember how you had to get your cursor or your mouse to start working again when it was a PS2 mouse?
You have to restart the PC.
You had to restart the entire PC. That is correct. There was none of this plug and play. You had to restart the whole computer to get it to come back. Well, in the late 90s, in NT 4.0, restarting a computer was like 7 to 8 minutes at least. Well, I would frequently go to someone's machine, and they would have maybe 2 or 3 different problems that they had, and I would try to work through the problems. And sometimes while working through the problem, I would do something that would cause the mouse to stop working. And so I'm sitting there, I've got 2 or 3 things to do, and back then, you all think reboots now, you have to reboot for everything. Back then, literally, you had to reboot for everything. You make one small change, it wants to reboot. So you could make 3 or 4 changes, and it would want you to reboot. So I'm sitting there trying to troubleshoot an issue, maybe 2 or 3 things, and all of a sudden the mouse stops working. I can reboot to get the mouse to come back, but that's 7 or 8 minutes. And remember, I'm working against Rob and Maribel, and we're trying to see who can close the most amount of tickets fastest. Well, if I have to reboot this machine 2 or 3 times, that's going to take 20 to 30 minutes right then just to reboot the machine. So when I lost the mouse, I didn't like to reboot the machine because that cost too much time. It's like having a server that's down and people can't get to it. You don't want to do things that are going to cost you extra time. And that was my equivalent back then. So I started to learn how to navigate through Windows without using a mouse, which I'm sure some of you have done to this day. Maybe your mouse battery stops working, or the mouse plug stops working, and you can use the keyboard shortcuts like Alt-Tab to go between windows, or you can up arrow or Control F4 closes windows. You can hit the Alt button and it brings down the file menu. Some of you, I'm sure, have used these before. So back in the late 90s, I was trying to become proficient at navigating with the keyboard because the mouse would often disappear. So one of the things that I needed to do was I needed to open the start menu. Does anyone know how you open the start menu in the late 90s on a Windows NT 4 machine when your mouse has disappeared? Did anyone ever run into this issue? So a lot of people say the Windows key. But the Windows key was not very popular 22 years ago. In fact, a lot of keyboards didn't have the Windows key. To this day, how do you open up the start menu without a mouse and without the Windows key? It still works right now to this day. Does anyone know how to open the start menu without a mouse and without the Windows key?
Control Escape.
Control Escape. That is correct. So Control Escape to this day still works. So I used to use Control Escape, and I would up arrow to settings, I would right arrow over to control panel, and I would get into the control panel, and a lot of the stuff I needed to do was in the control panel. And so I would tab around and use the arrow keys. Well, one day, I was trying to be fast, right? Because I'm trying to close tickets, and I did Control Escape, and I fat fingered Control Escape, and Task Manager popped up. And that was the day I discovered the fastest way to open up Task Manager. Does anyone know what keys I accidentally hit with Control Escape to bring up the Task Manager? There was another key that I hit by accident, and that's the day I learned. Does anyone know what 3 keys you press to open up Task Manager?
Control Escape.
It's Control, Shift, Escape. To this day, 22 years later, I still use Control, Shift, Escape to open up Task Manager. Why? I've been on several machines that it's so slow to respond that if you right-click the Start button, that may take 20 or 30 seconds just to bring up this menu. And if you click on Task Manager, that may take 20, 30 seconds, or maybe 2 or 3 minutes to bring up Task Manager. So let's just say your machine is slow, you're trying to troubleshoot it, you're physically on the server, maybe it's not a VM, and you're trying to troubleshoot what's going on. And you don't know, is Task Manager not coming up? because something's wrong? Or is it just that slow and you're having to wait for the screen to draw? Well, Control-Shift-Escape is the shortcut that launches Task Manager. So you don't have to worry about, is the screen frozen, and is the start menu frozen, or is your mouse not working? It's Control-Shift-Escape either brings up Task Manager or it doesn't. And if Task Manager doesn't come up with Control-Shift-Escape, you might as well just hold the power button down and shut the server off. But if it does come up, and you just simply can't use your mouse, then maybe there's just simply a problem with the mouse or the keyboard or something, and it's not the system is being overwhelmed. So to this day, I still have found the fastest way to open Task Manager is Control-Shift-Escape. I use it all the time. I'm in Task Manager all the time, multiple times a day. So I'm in Task Manager. What was the point? What were we talking about? We were talking about SBC host. And I took us back a little memory lane for a little bit of context and history on how Windows used to work. But let's go ahead and click on the Details tab, because that's where I would find SBC host. And I'm going to scroll down and look for SBC host. And what you're going to find is there's a lot of SBC host.exe processes. In fact, there's probably 40 or 50 here. This is not a bug. This is by design. So when you say, I have a problem with SBC host, and you Google search high CPU SBC host, well, there's 50 SBC host processes. So how do you know what it's doing? Is it Windows time? You know, when you double click Windows time, that apparently is SBC host. So maybe it's Windows time that's causing your high CPU issue on your machine. Or maybe Windows Update. Or maybe it's Windows Audio. Or maybe
So lahat sila SBC host.
user profile. So, you get my point. It could be a bunch of different services. Now, every service is not SBC host. Defender is MS Sense. NetLogon is LSAS. So not every single service is SBC host, but there are a lot of them. So when you have a problem with SBC host, how do you know which service it is? Let me show you. So if you have a problem with high CPU utilization from SBC host or high memory utilization from SBC host, it's real easy to figure it out. So if you have a problem with your server or your machine that you support, one of the first things we do is we open Task Manager. If it's a physical machine, I'm going to Control-Shift-Escape if I'm on the keyboard. If not, you can right-click Task Manager. One of the first things I'm going to check is I'm going to check the CPU to see, is my CPU running high utilization? Is my memory running high utilization? And if it is, I'm going to jump over to the Details tab and find out what is driving my CPU. So I go to the Details tab, I sort by CPU, and I see that maybe SBC host is the highest CPU utilization here. But how do I know what this is? Okay, let's talk about this column right here. It's PID, which is in all caps, also known as PID. Does anyone know what a PID is? Has anyone ever seen this before? Process ID? Process ID. What is a process ID?
Entry pass. Entry pass yan.
Or what is it used for? Okay. It may or may not be on in your Task Manager by default. So if you're in Task Manager right now, and I would encourage you to follow along if you like. If you're in Task Manager right now in the Details tab and you do not see Process ID, it's easy to add. You're going to right click, select columns, and you just want to check Process ID. I would encourage you to turn this on. Let me explain to you why. Let's just say we have a problem with SBC host. Well, all of these have the same name. So how do I distinguish one from the other? We have this ID, this unique number that's assigned to each process. No two numbers are the same. When a process starts, it gets assigned an ID, and it has that ID through the entire time that that process is living. So 5192 will stay with this specific process the entire life of this process. 4600 will stay with this process the entire time. Why is this important? Well, you may have the CPU spiking and it's SBC host, and you figure out it's 5192. Well, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later you look and SBC host is spiking again. Well, if you didn't look at the PID, how do you know it's the same SBC host process? It may not be. It may be 2664. So for you to keep track of, oh, it's SBC host again, you really need to track its process ID to ensure, is it 5192 every single time? Or is it sometimes it's 5192 and sometimes it's 5620 and sometimes it's 5288? Now remember, this is only for the life of that process. If you restart the machine or you restart the process, these numbers will all change. So if it's 5192 and then you reboot your machine for patches and the next day you have a problem with SBC host, you're going to more than likely not see a 5192. It probably won't even exist. And if it does exist, it's a different process. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to enable this column if it does not exist. That way I can track the process ID. Once I know the process ID, I can follow 5192. No matter if it's a CPU issue or a memory issue, I can follow it and I know that this is the same process. Okay, how does this help me figure out what it is though? I'm able to track it, but I still don't know who he is. So how do I figure that out? It's really easy. Let me show you. Once you find the process and you're able to track it, you can simply right-click that process. And there's an option here called Go to Services. You simply click it. So how did I do that? I'm going to show you one more time. SBC host, I found the one I want. It's 5192. It seems to have a problem every few minutes. I right-click the process, and there's an option that says Go to Services. What does that do? It just takes me over to the Services tab. I'm still in Task Manager. It just takes me from Details in the Services. And it highlights, look at this. We have the PID column. It highlights 5192. And it says 5192 is actually the radio management service. So now, if I'm having a problem with SBC host, I now know it's specifically the radio management service, and because I'm tracking the PID, I know that every 5 minutes or every 3 minutes, it's the same service. So now when I go to Google or Bing, and I do a search, I don't do a search on high SBC, high CPU, SBC host. I do a search on high CPU, radio management service. And now I'm going to more than likely get responses that are relevant to my problem. I don't want to troubleshoot Windows time if it has nothing to do with Windows time. You're wasting your time. So it's very important that we get a very good problem description. But more specifically, we get accurate information about the problem. The machine's sluggish. Why? High CPU. Why? SBC host is driving the CPU. Who is SBC host? SBC host 5192 is the radio management service. Or maybe it's Windows Update. And you could do a search and you get this step by step on how to troubleshoot high CPU for Windows Update. It's a lot better than simply just doing high SBC host, because there could be 40 or 50 different services. Okay, questions, comments, concerns on that specific component so far? So what are we talking about? We're talking about user mode, but more specifically, we're talking about services, which are executables, so are system processes, so are applications. This is all .exe. So we're talking about user mode. It has a lower privilege than kernel mode. They can still cause problems. And now we know a little bit more about services and a little bit more about SBC host and a little bit more about PIDs and Task Manager. Hopefully we know a little bit more. Okay, so let's take a look. Any questions on user mode? We're going to transition down into kernel. Any questions on what runs in user? So user, executables. Just remember that. Any questions on that? All right, let's talk about...
Just one question. Can we convert the application to services?
Yes, you can. Sure can. Yep. So you can take, if you want an application that you right now, you have to log in and you have to double click it to get it to start. Can you make that a service? You can. There's actually a registry key. So go to regedit. All services show up under HKey local machine, system, current control set, services. Oh. These are all the services on your machine. So like Windows Update, for instance, is right here. All right, so really you just have to go in and put a couple of keys in here. You just put in the image path and some other basic information. The issue that you're going to run into is there's not going to be a UI that the process or the application is going to have access to. So the service has to basically run without a UI, and the service has to work without a UI. But Windows, for sure, will allow you to run an application as a service. The question is, will the application allow you or work as intended as a service? So I have some, my wife and I are building a home, and I'm adding a bunch of home automation stuff to the house, as far as like lighting and various things. Well, one of the things that I have is a tool called AI tool, and what it does is it goes through and I have security cameras, and it goes and takes the security image and it analyzes it to see what's in the image. Is it a person? Is it a dog? Is it a cat? What is it? And it will send me a notification that says, hey, I just saw a person walking in front of your camera. That is an application that runs. But I need it to start up automatically, because if my server ever reboots that runs my cameras, I need it to automatically do that. So I went through and I set up this tool. There's no UI. It just takes a JPEG, analyzes it, and then dumps out information. And so I went through and set this tool to run as a service. That way, every time my machine reboots, it will automatically come up and start. So that's how I did it. There's a tool that they say you can download. This is how they did it here. But there are definitely ways to go ahead and to do that. In fact, let me see.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about kernel real quick. So kernel mode has what? A lot of cool stuff down here. Remember, this is the heart, the core of the operating system. So what do we have? We've got system threads. We'll talk about what a thread is a little bit later. The system service dispatcher, kernel mode callable interfaces. But what do we have? We have I/O manager. What is I/O? Is in all capital letters here. What does I/O stand for?
Input, output.
Input, output.
Yeah. What? Give me an. That's correct. Give me an example of input output. What would be an example of something that uses input output?
Command input.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So what about like a keyboard? Would a keyboard be input output?
Yeah. Input.
Yes.
Input. It would be. What about a mouse?
Input.
Input.
Input. Printer.
Output.
Hard drive.
Input.
Output.
Input. Output.
Output. It would be both. That is correct. Yeah. So network card, same thing. Input and output. So there's a whole component that handles input and output on a machine. I/O manager. We've got a cache manager, which helps with caching. Object manager, plug and play. So if you plug a device into your machine, plug and play manager is responsible for enumerating that device, figuring out what it is, and then finding the appropriate driver for it, installing it, and then configuring it. Security reference monitor, memory manager is responsible for keeping track of memory. Process manager, configuration manager is just another name for the registry. And then advanced local procedure call, also known as ALPC, which allows you to communicate with other services inside the machine. You got some graphics over here. And then down here, you have the actual kernel itself. So you're in kernel mode, but we have an actual kernel. That is actually an executable, believe it or not. It's the one executable that does not live in user mode. And the executable is named NTOS kernel, NTOSKRNL.exe. And then you have this thing called the HAL, which some of you may have heard of, called the hardware abstraction layer. And then under that, you have the actual, so Windows stops here. And then down here you have hardware. That is like your motherboard, your drives that are plugged in, your network cards. These are the actual physical devices. Okay, I'm gonna walk through a quick scenario and then we'll take a break. So the sooner we get through this scenario, the sooner we can take a break. I'm an application, and this application is called Notepad. Notepad needs to save something that our notes that we have down here at the bottom that I'm taking. It needs to save it to a thumb drive that lives down here. Okay. Does Notepad, who lives up here, know how to talk directly to the thumb drive down there? Do you think the developer who wrote Notepad knows the appropriate language to talk to your thumb drive?
No.
No, that is correct. It does not. Think about this. Maybe you have Notepad that was developed 10 years ago because you're running an older version of Windows and you have a brand new thumb drive. Can you really expect a developer from 10 years ago to know that 10 years later you're going to plug in a brand new thumb drive? Probably not. So what happens here? Notepad does not talk directly to the thumb drive. In fact, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it would be difficult for a developer to know what you're going to save to. Could be a thumb drive, could be a network share, it could be a local drive. The other thing is this, I don't want Notepad. What permissions does Notepad have again? What permissions are needed to run Notepad? Do you need to be an admin?
User, no?
No.
User.
No. And so, yeah, just regular user. So I don't want a regular user to be able to launch an executable that allows it to go directly to the thumb drive. That seems like it could be problematic. So what happens is this. Notepad makes a call into user mode, into this subsystem DLL. We call this call an API call. Does anyone know what API stands for?
API.
Application integration.
Yeah, so close. Application Programming Interface.
Okay.
So an API allows us, it's basically a developer that allows other people to utilize their code. So Notepad wants to go and save something. It could be to the thumb drive, it could be to a network share, it could be any drive level. It could be C drive, T drive, S drive, it could be a network share, it could be a thumb drive, it could be a local drive. All the developer Notepad has to do is call this API to save, we'll say to save this file. The API is actually called create file. Now, I'm going into detail because we're going to see this later. So the Notepad developer in his code says, oh, you want to save something? Okay, hold on. Microsoft has an API called create file that allows me to save stuff. So what does the developer need to know if he wants to save something? Well, the location would be one, and maybe the contents of what to save. As a developer of Notepad, I don't need to know what the S drive or what the T drive or any of the drives are. I just need to know, hey, I can call this API and pass in the location and the contents, and the rest of it will be handled for me automatically. Okay, we're going to build on this concept in a few minutes, but does everybody understand this so far? Does this make sense? Okay, let's look up the API create file. So I'm going to go to Bing. So if I'm a developer, is anyone on the call, have you ever done any development at all? Like even as a hobby or as a job? Okay, I'm not a developer either. So I have written some stuff, but just as a hobby. Okay, so I'm just going to do a search on Bing on create file. And you can see the first hit that comes back says, hey, there is a create file function here. We're going to click on it. So if I'm a developer and I want to be able to create a file, I can find this function and it gives me a description. And it says, the create file function, we'll talk about functions later, says that it can create or open a file or I/O device. Sweet. We are trying to open up the thumb drive. Now the interesting thing is, it says create file can create or open, so that's weird. We're calling a create file function that opens, but that's okay. And it says the most commonly used I/O devices are as follows: file stream, directory, physical disk, volume, console buffer, tape drive, communication. You get the idea. Okay. To perform this operation as a transacted operation, which results in a handle that can be used for transacted I/O use, the create file transacted function. Okay, so let's take a look. Here's the documentation for this API. So as a developer, I don't need to know about thumb drives and NASs and SANs and all that. I just need to know if I want to save something, create or open something, I simply call this. Well, what information is necessary? Well, it looks like I just have to pass this information. And the first one is the file name. So if I don't know what that means, I can scroll down and there are instructions that says, hey, the first parameter that you passed is the name of the file or device to be created or opened. Sweet. And then it tells me how to specify the path and the name. So as a developer, you don't have to know very much about kernel. You just have to be able to know there's an API and then be able to read the parameters and what to pass. It says desired access. What type of permission do you want to the file you're trying to open? Shared mode. Do you want someone else to be able to open the file if you have it open? Create disposition. If the file doesn't exist, do you want to create it? And you get the idea. There's a handful of things that we pass in. Okay, so as a developer of Notepad, I simply just call create file. And I pass in t:\John.text. That automatically goes and makes the necessary calls. Okay, we're going to pause right here, and we're going to take another break. And then when we come back, we'll go for about, we'll take a quick break, probably 9-ish minutes. We'll come back around 11:30. And then we're going to walk through those calls, and we're going to put a couple twists on it. And then as soon as we're done with that, we'll go ahead and break for lunch. So let's take one more quick break. We'll make this one a little bit shorter so we can come back and get what we need to have done for lunch. But I'm showing it's 11:16, so you all, I'm assuming it's a.m. So we'll just break for 9 minutes. I'll set the timer up, and then we'll come back for about 30 minutes. We'll go through 2 quick scenarios, and then we'll break for lunch. Any questions before we break for lunch? Break for this short break. Okay, I will set this for about 9 minutes. Let's do 8 minutes because I really want to get us back here at the half hour. We'll do a quick 8 minutes, and then we'll come back and go through the scenario.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.